Psalm 131 that we just read. You can probably figure out why we read that one this morning. This passage, Psalm 131, it's the only passage I know that's kind of like this, where David, a Psalm of David, he kind of just says, look, I'm trying to think of things. I'm trying to work things out in my mind. But there comes a point where I just can't do it anymore. I'm just kind of tired. And he says, I don't concern, in verse 1, myself with great matters, nor things too profound for me. Surely I have calmed and quieted myself like a weaned child with his mother, a child who is full and is sleeping peacefully. And it appears to me as this psalm was written at a time when David was trying to figure things out, and finally just said, you know what, I'm done trying to figure it out. I just have to relax. And thank God for his mercy and grace for me. Because that's what feeding a child is all about, right? You need mercy and grace to feed that child and get that child calmed down again. And I thought of this psalm as I continue to work my way through this challenging passage, 1 Corinthians 11. So let's turn back to that this morning. 1 Corinthians 11. Starting in verse 1, and of course reading through verse 16. Imitate me just as I imitate Christ. Now I praise you, brethren, that you remember me in all things and keep the traditions just as I delivered them to you. But I want you to know that the head of every man is Christ, the head of woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. Every man praying or prophesying with his head covered dishonors his head. But every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, for that is one and the same as if her head were shaved. For if a woman is not covered, let her also be shorn. But if it is shameful for a woman to be shorn or shaved, let her be covered. For a man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. For man is not from woman, but woman from man. Nor was man created for the woman, but woman for the man. For this reason the woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head, because of the angels. Nevertheless, neither is man independent of woman, nor woman independent of man in the Lord. For as woman came from man, even so man also comes through woman, but all things are from God. Judge among yourselves, is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not even nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a dishonor to him, but if a woman has long hair, it is a glory to her, for her hair is given to her for a covering. But if anyone seems to be contentious, we have no such custom, nor do the churches of God. Well, last week we came to this passage in an attempt, if you will, to do our best to make sure we understand it. And even if we can't understand all of it, we certainly have the obligation to apply what we do know. One of the problems that we run into when we come to passages like this, and we'll look at more next week, is how to apply. You see, we have to understand first before we apply, but sometimes we understand and still have a problem in application. Sometimes that happens. And I think this is one of these this morning. We know that there's some kind of covering here going on, that a woman is supposed to employ at a minimum in the service, at a minimum, that the man is not supposed to employ. We know this. But how to apply it? What does it actually mean? And it's kind of interesting because one of the reasons why this draws so much attention is because it's something obvious, something visible, especially if you're wearing a what I call an FSHC from last week, a foreign substance head covering. You see, someone can say, well, you know, we don't have idols in our home, but we don't know what's going on in that home necessarily. And we're okay, and we read the Bible and so forth, but we don't know what's going on there. But something worn on the head, everybody can see. And then we can all judge, right? Evaluate. Aha! that person's got something on their head. They're good or whatever. So it makes it real easy that way, and it makes it easy for us. I want to start out with a quote on the back of your bulletin from James B. Hurley as we look at this. Once again, this passage is necessary even while difficult, is what I want to get across this morning. I want to get across the necessity of this passage and point out that even if something's difficult, that doesn't mean it's not necessary. It might just mean you have to work harder at it. To this point, says Hurley, nothing has been said within the chapter to indicate that anything other than the maintenance of an authority symbol is under discussion. Through chapter 11, there has been no hint that women are not actually intended to pray or prophesy. Indeed, the opposite appears to be the case. Paul is concerned that proper authority, relations be maintained in the midst of a woman's exercising the gifts of prayer and prophecy. Paul's point was not that a woman might not pray or prophesy, but that while doing so, she must continue to maintain her proper relation to her husband. He was concerned to maintain the simultaneously operational authority of relations to God, Christ, man, and woman, which to me makes a lot of sense, because that's the way Paul starts his discussion, does he not, in verse 3? But I want you to know, brethren, that the head of every man is Christ, the head of woman is man, the head of Christ is God. We have four different entities there in relationship, and that's how Paul begins his discussion. And interestingly enough, Paul in 1 Corinthians, as we've seen, is very short on compliments to the Corinthians. Remember back in the beginning, he basically called them children. Pretty rough things to say. So I couldn't talk to you like adults. I had to talk to you like children. Later on in this same chapter, in verse 17, he says, I do not praise you. But here he says he does praise them. Apparently the Corinthians were attempting to go along with what Paul had said to them earlier, but a few problems had arisen. Again, this passage is necessary even while difficult. Today we're going to spend some time looking at the difficulties. Next week, then, I will let you know what I believe the passage actually teaches. So we'll keep you in suspense. I'm just so sure that you'll be dying all week to know. But we will let you know what at least I believe this passage is teaching and the textual support for it. That'll happen next week. Last week, we read a portion of a statement from Dr. Peter Hammond that demonstrated that the purpose of godless man is the overturning of God's order everywhere. Everywhere. Did you ever notice that the God-hating and bloody man, Karl Marx, and he was a man of blood. Did you ever notice that he made his bones, if you will, he made his comments. His writing was about economics. But did you ever notice how much he hated the family? He sought to break it up. He sought to ruin it. He sought to ruin the church. And we always have to ask the question, why did the God-hating Karl Marx, why didn't he just stop with economics? Why couldn't he just say, well, the state owns all the means of production and we'll collect all your money. But if you want to go to church, I don't care. And if you want to have a family, I don't care. It doesn't matter to me. It's the cost of moving forward to the next generation, my friends. And a cheap price it is. Karl Marx hated the family, hated children. But why couldn't he just let it alone? Why couldn't he just say, the state should have all your money, but you can go to church, we don't care. And you can have a family, you can stay married, we don't care. Why did he have to invade the church, and why did he have to invade the family? And his followers, the same thing. It's because godless man, be sure of one thing, godless man hates God and will attempt to overturn his order everywhere. Communists, says Peter Hammond, believe in what Vladimir Lenin called constructive chaos. Talked about that briefly last week. Lenin declared that evolution leads to revolution. He also taught that communists must create conflict class warfare, race war, whatever is necessary to break down the existing structures and provide fertile ground for revolution and restructuring of all of life around the Communist Party, leading to the dictatorship of the proletariat. End of quote. See, it wasn't enough for Marx and Lenin to get your money. They had to destroy everything. Since God is no longer here to be killed, this is godless man now. Since God is no longer here to be killed, the next best thing is to kill everything that looks like God or reminds them of God. And if there is order in the family, and if there is order in the church, and Paul is arguing for both in our passage here. He's arguing for order. If there's order there, then godless man will want to reach in and destroy that order. And don't believe them when they say, well, you know what? You idiot Christians, stay inside your church. We don't care what you say in your church. Just let us run things out here because we know what we're doing. Don't believe them, because they do care what's going on inside this church. And they will destroy it if they can. But we've made a deal with them in modern Christianity. We've made a deal. We've said, we'll let you alone out there if you let us alone in our church. And you know what? That's a deal with the devil. We'll keep we're doing a great job keeping our end of that bargain, aren't we? We're not saying anything to them. But more and more they're coming in and tell us what we can and cannot do. And in our families as well. And as we pointed out before, again, many times, and we'll point it out again, there is one man in history that learned that the very difficult way, the hard way, and that's our friend Lot, right? Our friend Lot was tight with all the sodomites. And he thought he was safe in his house, and he found out the hard way he wasn't. The first place, let's not forget, as they seek to destroy everything that looks like God, everything. The first place where God speaks to us is always in terms of authority. You can say that there is always a competing authority source somewhere. That should not surprise us. We should, however, be surprised that anyone would ever question the authority of the Creator by the created. And of course, that's Paul's point in Romans 9. We don't have time to turn there. It's a shocking thing that the created would question the Creator. You and I wouldn't think of approaching with no training whatsoever an architect who built a skyscraper. I still don't get skyscrapers. I don't see how you can even do that. I don't understand that. How they can even exist. With all the wind load. I mean, I know what a wind load is. I drive across a bridge sometimes, the wind load on my car. How do you build a skyscraper that can stand wind? I don't understand that. But I wouldn't think of challenging an architect or a builder of something like that. Say, why'd you build it that way? I think I know better how to do that. I wouldn't think of it. You wouldn't either. But we think nothing of telling God the way he should be running his universe. Think nothing of it. And it's shocking. It should be shocking to us. Let's look. And this is where we want to start this morning. We want to talk first about authority, then we want to talk about challenges to interpretation, which is where we dropped off last week. I want to look at 4 groups of people that reacted against the authority of Christ when confronted by that authority and were commanded to respond to obedience to that authority and did not. First of all, I want to talk about the good people. Genesis 3. Let's go there. These are the good people. Now, Christ said there's none good but God, but maybe we're working the definition a little bit this morning here. But if anybody could be said to be good, I think we can say that it would be Adam and Eve prior to their fall. Verse 2, and the woman said to the serpent, we may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God has said, you shall not eat it, nor shall you touch it, lest you die. And then the woman in verse 6, so when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, pleasant, please the eyes, desirable to make one wise, she took of the fruit and ate. Now, this is one of the most simple cases of authority, God's authority over people, that we have in all of Scripture. Could anything be simpler? How many times have we heard, well, you know what, the Bible's really complicated. We have a complicated passage this morning. We get it. But there's so much of the Bible that's really, really simple. And there could be nothing simpler, I don't think, in the whole wide world than this instruction. Here's a tree. Here's other trees. You're allowed to eat all those other trees, not this one. Pretty simple. God meeting Adam and Eve here in terms of authority. And they decided that their authority was legitimate and God's was not. So that's the good people. Now the powerful people, Psalm 2. Verse 1, why do the nations rage and the people plot a vain thing? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us break their bonds in pieces and cast their cords from us. How are, in this passage, the kings of the earth, the powerful people, the protected class, the elite, the ones who live above the problems that they cause for everyone else? Have you ever noticed that? Passed legislation that applies to everybody but them. These people. You know, it's an amazing thing. This passage points out these kings that are fighting God. You know, it's an amazing thing. Man fights God's authority with his own authority, and then he can't even live with his own authority. You ever think about that? God's out. Okay, let's pass laws like Social Security in which we will force people to pay into it, and then we're going to take care of them by paying back out of it, we say. And guess who's exempt? The people that pass the law. They hate God's authority. They can't even live with their own. But God meets them here. Let us break their bonds in pieces, verse 3, and cast away their... Why are they saying this? Because God is telling them how they must rule, how they must live, and they don't want to hear it. The powerful people meeting God's authority. The religious people. Turn, if you would, to Mark 12. Mark chapter 12, verse 1. Then he began to speak to them in parables. A man planted a vineyard and set a hedge around it and dug a place for the wine vat and built a tower. And he leased it to vine dressers and went into a far country. Now at vintage time he sent a servant to the vine dressers that he might receive some of the fruit of the vineyard from the vine dressers. And they took him and beat him and sent him away empty-handed. Again he sent them another servant, and at him they threw stones, wounded him in the head, and sent him away shamefully treated. And again he sent another, and him they killed, and many others, beating some and killing some. Therefore, still having one son, his beloved, he also sent him to them last, saying, they will respect my son. But those vine dressers said among themselves, this is the heir. Come, let us kill him, and the inheritance will be ours. So they took him and killed him and cast him out of the vineyard. Therefore, what will the owner of the vineyard do? He will come and destroy the vine dressers and give the vineyard to others. Have you not even read the scripture? The stone which the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. This was the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. And this verse 12 tells us that they got the point. And they sought to lay hands on him, but feared the multitude, for they knew he had spoken the parable against them, so they left him and went away. Bible study's over. Christ just said that he's the one that they're talking about here. It's an amazing thing. This is one of the most amazing, there's a lot of amazing passages in the Bible. But this is really amazing because they knew that parable spoken against them, and then they go out and plot to do exactly what the parable said would be done. I mean, if you wanted to prove Christ wrong, this would be your moment, right? This would be your opportunity. Hey, look, whatever plots are going on right now to kill Jesus, let's put a stop to it. But they go out and prove what he said. They are running into his authority. It's his Father's vineyard. He owns the vineyard. He's the son. He's the heir. This is his vineyard, not theirs. And they want to kill him and make it theirs. These are the deeply religious people who I'm sure had great authority and great power, and people listened to what they had to say, and they had a knowledge, and they probably all knew Hebrew, and because of this time the Jewish people were speaking Greek. They were respected, they were loved. And Christ here has an awful thing to say to them, that if you reject my authority over my vineyard, I will destroy you. The religious people meeting God's authority. And then the smart people. The smart folks. Acts 17. This is Paul on Mars Hill at the Areopagus, where all the smart people sat around just trying to think of some new thing. They didn't have any work to do. They had slaves to do that. In the Greek culture and the Roman culture, you didn't work with your hands. That was something for the slaves. And it was a social put down that if you knew how to work with your hands, or if you did work with your hands, that was socially unacceptable. These people didn't work. Sat around and discussed. Verse 21 of Acts 17, for all the Athenians and the foreigners who were there spent their time in nothing else but either to tell or to hear some new thing. Listen to what Paul says. Paul is going to hit them with the authority of God. Men of Athens, halfway verse 22, I perceive in all things that you are very religious, for as I was passing through and considering the objects of your worship, I even found an altar with this inscription to the unknown God. Therefore, the one whom you worship without knowing, him I proclaim to you. King James, there, the authorized version says, whom you ignorantly worship. Now, we can't just look at a passage like this and just keep moving. Even saying without knowing or ignorantly. Do you understand? Do you understand how insulting that would have been to those people? Do we get it at all? Here's Paul, the persecuted, probably a small man. We don't know this for sure, but we think so. We do know that some people said that he was insignificant. His words were weighty, the Corinthians said later. But in person, he was just unimpressive. And saying to these folks, you don't know anything about worship. He says at first, he says, you're really religious. And then he says, you don't know what you're worshiping. Wow. And I've had people tell me that this passage tells us how to witness because, Paul, he just sort of fit into the culture. He didn't offend anybody. What? This was offensive. And he's right out of the gate with it. And then he goes on to say, God who made the world and everything in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth. Starting out, Paul is with the authority of God over them. And one of our problems that we have is we want to say, God, explain yourself to me first, and then I'll obey you. Opposite. God has authority. We need to obey him. Well, that is an introduction to what we're talking about this morning. The authority of God in his word and the necessity of us obeying him. This brings us to our topic this morning. The authority of Christ over his church and everything connected to it in view of our passage here in 1 Corinthians 11. So, while parts of this passage may be difficult and are, we can't say that all of it is difficult. So for a hermeneutical principle or a Bible interpretation principle, and I realize that word hermeneutic sounds like, somebody's uncle or something. First name Herman, last name Neutic. We're talking about principles of biblical interpretation. So when you hear that term, that's what that means. Hermeneutics. For a hermeneutical principle, we understand that we will never understand the difficult parts of Scripture if we refuse to believe and obey the simple parts. We can't sit around in our ivory little tower and say, you know what? Since I can't understand all of it, I'm going to refuse to obey any of it. And we must know that the beginning of our understanding always starts with our obedience. See, that was Eve's problem, wasn't it? She looked at the tree and said, oh, now I understand what God wants. And she substituted her understanding for what she thought God wanted for God's authority. And this passage is just as authoritative as any others. But our challenge here is one of application more than it is one of interpretation. It's interpretation too, but it's more application. We know that a woman must have her head covered and that a man must not. But how is that to be applied? Now, to continue our message from last week, I just want to quickly take a quick look at those six different approaches to this passage. We will not elaborate on them. The first one being the culturally conditioned covering. Submission stays, but foreign substance head coverings on women is optional, depending on the symbolisms of the culture in which the church exists. I didn't mention it last week, but this is John MacArthur's view. Basically says, look, that was a symbol of submission back then. Other cultures have different symbols of submission, so we need to adapt to that. And if we figure out what the symbol of submission is, then that's what we'll engage in. One writer even breaks it down to wedding bands, basically saying they didn't do wedding bands for marriage back then. They did hair. Nowadays we do wedding bands. Secondly, foreign substance head covering is required for women in public worship, no matter what the cultural conditions or time and place of that public worship. Puritans, Presbyterians, Calvin, it appears, had this view, and contemporarily by Philip Kaiser and Pastor Bill Einwachter, whose 6 breakdowns I'm utilizing here. Thirdly, no foreign substance identified in the passage at all. Instead, it's more about hairstyle, more specifically hair length on both women and men. In other words, basically that the woman should have a feminine type of hairstyle to distinguish herself from men, and that's what Paul's point is. And then we briefly discussed what we call the traditional Mennonite view, that the foreign substance head covering applies. By foreign substance, I'm talking about cloth or some type of a visible symbol that's not hair. It applies at all times, places, and possible conditions. They don't wear it when they go to bed, for example. Nor do they feel they're required to. They go to sleep. And then, fifthly, this passage only applies to women praying, and this is an interesting one. This passage only applies to women praying and prophesying outside the church, because later on in 14 and in 1 Timothy they say that God prohibited women from praying and prophesying in the church. So clearly this only applies to women outside the church. It sounds a little crazy at first, but when you think about it, it makes a little bit of sense, depending on what you believe about what the other passages teach. And then 6, we didn't spend too much time on this, the evangelical feminist view. That is, there is no foreign substance head covering in view here, because there's no covering here at all, as this passage is a complete cultural, shall we say, anomaly. It doesn't apply at all. It was for them. We live in a different time. It just doesn't apply. So I can't tell how they apply it, because they don't apply it. It's like a passage doesn't exist. We now wish to take up where we finished last week, and that is speaking of the difficulties in both interpretation and application of this passage. So I think there's some simple applications, but the interpretation is still very difficult. And I have, to wrap up our time here this morning, we'll try to do it fairly quickly. We do want to share in communion this morning. We'll perhaps cut this just a little bit short, but I have 12 challenges in interpreting this passage that I want to talk about this morning, some of which we talked about last week, or at least addressed. First one, that approach there, going back to 1 Corinthians chapter 11. First one I want to address, we talked about this last week, is verse 10. And we said that, at least as I study the passage, looking for an interpretive key to the passage, verse 10 seems to be critical. For this reason, or for this cause. You see a phrase like that in Scripture, you want to pay attention to it, because an explanation is coming. And I said last week, the explanation here is almost harder to interpret than the rest of it. For this reason, the woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. So our first challenge here. What are the angels doing in the middle of this passage? Why are they here? So that's an interpretive challenge. And the second interpretive challenge in the same passage here. For this reason, the woman ought to have a symbol of authority or power on her head because of the angels. What is that power? And what is that symbol of authority? And how does that work here? Remember last week we talked briefly that the symbol of authority there, a symbol, is been added by the translators. What if we read that without that? For this reason, the woman ought to have authority on her head or on head because of the angels. Could it be that the woman actually has authority on her own head? Is it possible? So that's an interpretive challenge there in the key. Thirdly, we have angels. What's that mean? Why are they there? Power. What's that word mean? Or authority. What's that doing there? Thirdly then, the word head or source. And we can't gloss over this. This is really important. You wouldn't fare very well without your head. Think of a body that is disconnected to the head, or at least is not connected well. A body that is disconnected is dead. Think about it. Your body, whatever you can do with your body, it does nothing without its head. But if it's connected but not well, then we might call it spastic or something. You know, the head can't really control the body. Now, there's various diseases, horrible diseases that occur when a person's head cannot tell their body what to do. This use of the word head appears an awful lot in this passage, but we don't always know exactly who it's applying to. When you read different authors, they apply it differently. Look at this. Verse 3 is pretty simple. I want you to know that the head of every man is Christ, the head of woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. But every man praying or prophesying having his head covered dishonors his head. Is that head Christ? Or is that his own head? Interpreters are all over the place on this one. Actually, they're more together on this one. But then every woman, look at this. Every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. Is that her husband? Or is that her own head? For that is one and the same as if she were shaved. Verse 7. For a man indeed ought not to cover his head. Okay, now this is interesting, because a lot of interpreters said back in verse 3, or verse 4, every man praying or prophesying having his head covered dishonors his head, and they say that means Christ. Okay, but then we get down to verse 7, now it's his own head, right? For a man indeed ought not to cover his head. So now it's his own. Verse 10. For this reason the woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. Could this mean that she needs to have a symbol of authority on her head? Her head being her husband? Well, later on we know it's talking about her head because verse 15, if a woman has long hair, okay, now we've got it. We're definitely talking about her head right there, her own head on top of her shoulders. Challenge to interpret. Head, what's it mean? Verse 13 is another one for me. This, judge among yourselves, is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? That is a very interesting comment there by Paul. Would you have thought up to this point, the way Paul has been talking to the Corinthians, the things that he said to him, back in chapter 5, he basically said, you people, you're taking each other to court. Is there any wise person among you who can judge between people? You ought to be ashamed for taking your brothers and sisters to court. Shame on you for doing that. Don't you have anyone wise among you? And then he says here, like, judge among yourselves, and it seems like there is something so obvious that they should be able to get it. And this is intriguing to me because here we are, 2,000 years later, twisting ourselves up into knots, or as Albert Barnes said last week, creative ingenuity. And we're trying to get this, and it seems like this is so obvious that Paul could say to people who he said were children, or he addressed them as children, you figure it out. Isn't this obvious to you? That is, verse 13 for me at least, an incredible interpretive challenge. You people can figure it out. You're Corinthians after all. I'll tell you one thing, Paul doesn't talk like this too often in this book, either in this book or the second book. He doesn't say. Most of the time he's saying, you guys are kind of pathetic. Not here. You can figure it out. And then that appeal to nature, number 5. Does not even nature itself teach you that a man has long hair is a dishonor to him? Pastor Philip Kaiser, very careful theologian, scholar, and exegete, comes up with 4 separate meanings to nature.